In June 1977, a teenage boy was riding his bicycle in a rural area off Old Union Church Road in Townsend, Delaware, when he passed a drainage ditch. As he rode by the ditch near a wooded area, he looked down and saw the body of a deceased naked woman. The woman had no identification, and the medical examiner determined that she had likely been there for several weeks. There was a fracture on one of her fingers that suggested that she had fought back against her attacker. There was also a possibility that she had suffered blunt force trauma to the head. She was also missing some teeth, including one of her upper front teeth, but dental records yielded no results. At the time of her disappearance, police relied on fingerprints and dental records to match missing persons with human remains. She was thought to be between 40 and 55 years old and was 5 foot 3 inches tall with dark blonde hair. Her death was ruled a homicide, but police couldn't link her to any missing persons report and the case went cold. In 2008, information on the unidentified body, including a DNA profile, was submitted to CODIS, a national DNA database run by the FBI, but nothing turned up at the time. But in February of 2017, police in Newcastle County learned of Parabon Nanolabs, a company that specializes in DNA phenotyping. DNA phenotyping is a process by which physical traits and ancestry can be predicted using DNA. Police submitted the woman's DNA profile to Parabon Nanolabs, who in turn generated a sketch and a digital image of the woman. They also sent her genetic information to ancestry databases to try and link her to a potential family tree. In 2019, officers from Newcastle Police attended a law enforcement cold case seminar where Stephen Smugareski, a genealogy specialist with the Montgomery County Police Department in Maryland, was speaking. After they shared information with him, he would take over the genetic research aspect and comb through potential family trees and followed up on leads to collect DNA samples from possible relatives. These samples were then entered into CODIS and they finally got a match. The body belonged to Laurie Petry Heiser, a 50-year-old wife and mother of 2 children. Strangely, she was never reported missing by her husband, William Heiser Sr., who was a member of the Philadelphia Police Department's Highway Patrol in the 50s and early 60s. However, he would leave the police force after being seriously injured while rehearsing for one of his thrill shows. He often performed these thrill shows in area stadiums and arenas as a motorcycle daredevil with the Highway Patrol. Marie was a homemaker and also worked part-time at the Ashbourne Country Club in Cheltenham, Pennsylvania, and was known for being very involved in her community. Their son, William Heiser Jr., was at boarding school when his mother went missing, and when he came home, his father told him and his sister that their mother had packed up and left the family. What's even more strange is that if she packed up and left, she must have not taken much with her, because her son says he remembers most of her clothes being left behind. He also remembers her being a loving mother and a good person, saying they would go to the Jersey Shore and walk the boardwalk together. Heiser Jr., now 68 and a retired sheriff's deputy, believes his father had nothing to do with his mother's disappearance and would never hurt anyone. He describes his father as a saint that took care of his family and never raised his voice or hands. He says he never suspected that their mother had been murdered. Suspiciously, in December 1977, just 5 months after her body was found, her husband sold the family home and moved to South Daytona Beach, Florida. Unfortunately, William Heiser Sr. passed away from cancer in 2006 and took with him any details he may have had on the death of his wife. Although her murder remains a cold case, Marie Petry Heiser finally got her identity back after 44 long years. On October 5, 2003, at about 1:25 p.m., sheriff's deputies responded to an apartment complex in the 1600 block of Hilton Head Court in Rancho, San Diego, for a report of possible body parts found in a dumpster by a worker. When further investigation was done by deputies, it was confirmed to be that of 2 human legs that belonged to an adult female. Upon examination, it was determined that the victim most likely met her demise within 24 hours of the legs being discovered. While the death of the victim could not be determined, it was definitely ruled a homicide. Unfortunately, with a lack of information, they were not able to identify the female, and the case would go cold for nearly 17 years. Finally, in June of 2020, the case was selected to be worked using investigative genetic genealogy. During the process, at least 20 family members were contacted and interviewed to further progress the family DNA of the still unknown sample. Each person had to give their full consent to have their DNA used to create a family tree, and not a single person denied the request. The cold case team then formed family histories in the form of trees, which led detectives to other potential relatives of the Jane Doe. When speaking with relatives, detectives identified themselves, telling the person what they were investigating, and explained the process and asked for their assistance. This process eventually led investigators to closer relatives and ended with contacting the victim's son, who is now in his 50s. He provided a DNA sample, and the victim was finally identified as Laurie Diane Potter. Investigators learned that in 2003, Laurie was 54 years old and lived in Temecula, California with her husband, Jack Dennis Potter. On May 12, 2021, the San Diego Regional Fugitive Task Force arrested 68-year-old Jack Potter at his apartment in Rancho Cucamonga for the alleged murder of his wife, Laurie. Jack was transported to the San Diego Central Jail and booked into custody for one count of murder. Investigators said there was substantial and conclusive evidence that Jack Potter killed his wife, but declined to go into specifics as the case is still ongoing. Laurie was never reported missing, and her family assumed she was alive but living elsewhere. The only person who knew she was dead, according to investigators, was her husband. The investigation into the murder of Laurie Potter is still ongoing, and the cold case team would like to speak with anybody who knew Laurie in the 80s or Jack over the last 40 years. This will definitely be a case to watch as more details of the crime are released, and I hope to provide further updates at a later time.